Hello everybody and welcome to another Flyin Miata Facebook Live. My name is Keith Tanner and I'm going to be talking about brake theory today, which sounds pretty exciting, but trust me, it's actually kind of interesting. Well, I think so anyway. If you are digging the content of this video and some of the other ones we've done on suspension tech and theory, that sort of thing, I strongly recommend this book. Written by myself, I will admit, but it has a rundown of all sorts of basic knowledge you need in order to be able to modify your Miata to determine, should I put on sway bars or different springs, or should I change out my proportioning valve, or should I put on bigger calipers. A lot of that stuff is in here. It's a good book. I really like this one. Oddly not available from Flyin Miata right now. Still trying to work that one out, but you can get it from Amazon, your public library, Barnes & Noble, anywhere you can buy quality books. So, brakes. There's a lot of talk about brakes, a lot of enthusiasm about brakes, because people don't like hitting stuff. And there are a huge number of brake kits available on the market, all sorts of upgrades you can get for your brakes, and a lot of confusion as to what does someone really need in order to make their Miata work properly. So I'm going to talk about the theory of what's going on here. We're going to start by defining two types of braking situations, or two areas of braking that need to be discussed. The first is single stop. How short can you stop? What's the minimum stopping distance, and what can you do to help that? And the other one is going to be multiple stops. You've got your car out in the track for a track day. You can only make it 5 sessions or 5 laps, whatever, before your brakes overheat. What do you deal with there? Because they're very different attributes to a braking system. You can have a braking system that can stop really, really short once, or you can have a system that doesn't stop super short, but it will do it all day long. And which one of those you need depends on what you're planning on doing. I also have a whole bunch of questions here that people have sent in, 3 pages of them. I will try to address all of these as we go. If you have questions during this video, assuming you're not watching on YouTube in the year 2030 or something, please put them in the comments, pop them up there. I will do my best to answer any of those, to clarify anything that I've skipped. So let's talk about single stop braking distances. This is all about traction. Your car has a certain amount of traction available to it that comes out of your tires, and all the brakes can do is fail to take advantage of that grip. And there's a bunch of different ways it can fail to take advantage of that grip, but really it comes down to, first off, you need to have the actual physical traction. So if you want to be able to stop from 70 miles an hour in 100 feet on glare ice, you got a problem. So this traction, how can we fail? Don't mind me, I have notes. How can we fail to take advantage of it? The biggest things are proportioning and modulation. Now, as to why we need proportioning, I'm going to get into the real nerdy stuff and start talking about weight transfer. If you've ever ridden a bike, or motorcycle, I'm sure, but we've all ridden bicycles for sure. When you put the brakes on hard, it's really easy to lock up the back wheel, and that's because of weight transfer. I have my little model here. What happens when you're tearing along the road, you hit the brakes, the body of the car, the mass of the car tries to keep going, and it forces more weight onto the front wheels and takes weight off the back wheels. And as I'm sure you know, the more weight you have on a set of wheels, the more traction they have. This means that you have more traction available to brake in the front and less in the rear. This means that the more weight transfer you have, the more front brake bias you need and the less rear brake bias you need. If you have too much rear brake bias, you lock the back brakes and then you spin backwards and have an accident that damages the back of the car. If you have too much front bias, then you lock up the front brakes and you go straight into the thing that you're looking at and you damage the front of the car. We are looking to damage neither end of the car, so we want ideal proportioning. Now, ideal proportioning is tricky because it moves. Chart. This is showing the amount of brake pressure we have on the front versus the amount of brake pressure we have in the rear. I'm just talking about the hydraulics here. You step on the pedal, it puts a certain amount of pressure down the hydraulic system, and if there wasn't a proportioning valve, it would be a straight line. So at 45 degrees, this means that for X amount of front pressure, you have X amount of rear pressure. Now the job of the proportioning valve is, as you get that weight transfer towards the front, and the front get more grip and the rear gets less grip, you need more front pressure or less rear pressure for a given amount of front pressure. I'm not sure if you follow that, but basically we need the front brakes to do more work the harder we brake. And the ideal curve is kind of funny. It actually it is a curve. It looks like that. it's maybe not exactly. We're dealing with rough things here. But as you transfer more and more weight to the front, you have less and less traction in the back, and you want the rear brakes to be doing less and less work. Unfortunately, without electronic intervention, this is a very difficult curve to arrange. So what we've come up with as a society is a proportioning valve that's just a ball and spring. It comes up on this 45-degree angle for a little while, and at some point it has a knee point, and it goes, and it goes off at a different angle. And you can see it sort of does its best. That's a straight line. It sort of does its best to approximate this curve. An adjustable portioning valve moves this point around. So if it's set for a lot of rear, it'll brake there, or it could be set to brake down here. The effect is that for a given amount of front brake, you have different amounts of rear brake going on. I'm not sure that was really helpful. But effectively, that's what we're doing with the proportioning valve. One thing to know, if you're using dual master cylinders with a bias valve or bias bar, which is very much a race thing to do, you've got a straight line. You just change with that bias valve or bias bar, you just change the direction of a straight line. So it's really only good for maximum effort braking for one situation. This probably has not helped at all. Anyhow, so brake proportioning is important to short stops, because if you have too much front or too much rear, you will lock those brakes and you're not able to take full advantage of the other brakes. And this can be a problem when you put on, say, a big, shiny, big brake kit. If I took this little 1994 Miata and put a massive brake kit on the front and added lots and lots of braking power on the front, my proportioning would be all jacked up, because now the fronts would be braking really, really hard, and if I was just doing light braking, I'd be locking up the backs. So that's a problem. Yeah, there we go. So what we're really looking to do is to get minimum stopping distance, is we want to get that proportioning set up right. You can do that either with an adjustable proportioning valve, like the one that we sell from Willwood, or you can do it by matching your front and rear brake systems properly. You know, using the right size calipers, the right pads, the right size rotors, and matching them front to rear. Mazda, when they first started making Miatas in the early days, they had a lot of front bias from the factory. And they gradually started moving the amount of bias from the factory further back. Starting with the 2001 sport cars, they went to electronic brake distribution, which means basically the ABS system is doing it live in a living color all the time. And that's been the case for the NCs and the NDs. We have a question? Nope, no question. So, how does the big brake kit mess with the proportioning? Well, there's two aspects to it, but it basically comes down to brake torque. Brake torque is the amount of retardation, the amount of torque that the braking system applies to the wheel for a given, say, pedal pressure. There's all sorts of hydraulic tricks you can play with this, but it comes down to what are the size of the pistons in the caliper and what's the diameter of the rotor. If you just increase the rotor diameter, don't change anything else, you'll get more brake torque, because you've effectively got a bigger lever for the braking system to work on. If you go and put on a big caliper, if the pistons are well chosen, it may not have much effect on your brake torque. It may increase your front brake torque, that sort of thing. People like a lot of brake torque because it feels as if the brakes are very, very strong, that they're doing a lot. The problem is that too much brake torque can sometimes mean that it's difficult to modulate, and that's the other side of our minimum distance question. As you probably remember from high school physics, the coefficient of sliding friction is less than the coefficient of rolling friction. What this means is when you lock a tire, it doesn't have as much grip as it does when it's rolling. So as soon as you lock a tire, and we've all felt this, if you do lock up, it feels like all of a sudden you're on ice and the car accelerates. If you do lock those tires, then you have lost a bunch of grip. So the purpose of modulation, especially on cars with ABS, is the ability to keep the brakes right at that threshold of lockup, right where about 10% slip, where you get the maximum traction. And if it's difficult to modulate because you've either got a big floppy caliper that's got springs in it, or feels like it's got springs, or you've got a really, really grabby pad or something, you can find yourself having a hard time staying right on that edge of lockup. And so that modulation becomes important. That's where a very grippy pad, a very big rotor can actually be detrimental to your braking distance. So that's single stop. It's actually pretty easy to understand. Use all the traction you have. Oh, one more thing about brake transfer is, or weight transfer is, of course, it's related directly to how tall your car is. The higher your car is, the more transfer it gets. So all you guys running around on 3-inch lift kits, you're going to get more weight transfer. All you guys who are slammed, you get less of it. It's also related to how quickly you're decelerating. the harder you're braking, the harder you're decelerating, the more transfer there is. And you can see it when you look at a car. That body movement is the reaction from weight transfer. So if you're on the track with sticky hot race rubber, you're going to get a lot more weight transfer than you will if you're driving around on a cool fall evening on street tires. And so your ideal proportioning will adjust for that if you want the perfect proportioning. That's one reason why when I'm building a race car, I will tend to put the proportioning valve, the adjuster, in the cockpit where I can screw with it as I'm driving. Passengers get a little freaked out when you start adjusting the brakes between corners, but it does mean you can get the maximum braking out of it. Okay, now for the other fun one, multiple stops, and this comes into heat. And here we get into an equation you may have seen before. Braking is basically the process of turning kinetic energy into, well, heat energy, which is not a form of kinetic energy, but we'll call it that. And the formula, amount of energy, this is not going to be a difficult one. I'm just going to write a formula down. It's a very complicated formula. You might have seen this somewhere before. Sometimes it's got the speed of light in there, but the amount of energy involved is the mass of the car times the square of the velocity. Now that square has got some interesting side effects. It means that if you double the weight of a car, you've got twice as much energy. So your braking system has to work twice as hard to slow the car down. But if you double the speed of the car, you've got 4 times the energy, 4 times the heat, 4 times the speed to get rid of. So that's why braking upgrades, heat upgrades, are more important for fast cars than they are for heavy cars. Everyone always thinks, oh, Miata's light, it doesn't need a lot of brake. But we specialize in making them fast here. You put a V8 in a Miata, you've made it a little bit heavier, but you've made it a whole lot faster. And so that square on the V becomes very important. It has some interesting side effects too. It also means that slowing from 50 miles an hour to 30 miles an hour involves less energy than slowing from 70 to 50. There's still a 20 miles an hour difference in each one, but if you do the math and you run this V squared in there, all of a sudden you'll discover there's a lot more energy involved in decelerating from higher speeds. So if you find yourself putting stickier tires on your car and your lap times go down because your average speed is up by 10 miles an hour around the entire track, you're going to find that you're actually working the brakes harder simply because all your speeds are higher. You're trying to shed more energy. So, heat. Heat is our enemy when it comes to multiple stops, race cars. The heat starts off by, it's generated at the friction surface between the pad and the rotor. So those get the heat first. Your pads absorb some of the heat, the rotor absorbs some of the heat. The rotor's cast iron for a reason. It's a big heat sink. That's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to capture that heat. The pad will have to capture some of that heat as well. If it can't handle that, some of it's going to start leaking into the caliper, it'll start leaking into the fluid, and then we get into fluid heat control problems. So the best thing we can do is store the heat in the rotor specifically and then get rid of it as soon as possible. And that's why ducting is the #1 upgrade you can do for managing heat on a race car. You've really got to just get air flowing over those brakes so that the rotor can dump it out into the atmosphere, make it go away, and then take a new chunk of heat when it goes. This is also why, I don't have a sample here for you, why the thickness of your brake pads is important. If you're going out on the track and you've got some pads that are pretty good but they're getting a little thin, they can't absorb as much heat because there's just not as much pad, there's not as much material there. And so what's going to happen is those pads will get hot, it'll get into your fluids, and you're more likely to boil your fluid than you were if you were running full depth pads. So if you fail a tech inspection because your pads are too thin, that's the reason, because it's working the rest of your brake system too hard. So there are different, and of course, if things get too hot, we get into fade. And there's different kinds of fade, and it's important to determine which one you have so you can address it properly. One is pad fade. That's where the pad gets overheated. It simply cannot deal with that level of temperature, and I'll get to that in a moment. And pad fade feels as if the pedal steel feels good, but it's like your pads, they're bricks now. They've turned into pieces of wood. They're not doing squat, and that's because they've overheated. They've lost their friction. And if you want to deal with that, you need either pads built for higher temperatures, or you need better ducting. But that's what a pad fade feels like. If you manage to boil your fluid, that's when you get the classic long pedal. You get air in the system. If you've overheated the fluid, you get air in the system. It boils, and your pedal goes long. You try to apply the brakes, and it goes, whoa, down to the firewall. You hit it again, it comes back because you're compressing that air. But you've overheated the fluid, and that means it's time to flush your fluid, change your underwear, and maybe look at a higher rated fluid when you're done. So let's, oh, and about the rotors, the two-piece rotors are very popular in big brake kits. And one of the reasons is to keep the rotating mass down. Rotors need mass, that's part of their job, but they only need a certain amount of it. So the idea with a two-piece rotor is that the big rotor ring where you do all the hard work, where you're clamping on it, that sort of thing, that's made of cast iron, and then the center is a lighter weight aluminum, which can also help disperse the heat a little bit better. Overall, they're not going to have as much heat handling capability as a single-piece rotor, but it is concentrated where you can use it. So we're going to talk about friction and heat now. Brake pads, I can't remember what this looks like. So this, another chart, and you should be able to find this. If you're looking at any race pad, or any brake pad really, you should be able to find a chart that looks like this. This is going to be temperature, and this is mu. This basically means the amount of friction. So what this shows you is the amount of bite, of grab, of friction that the pad has for a given temperature. A street pad is going to look something like this and fall off. So it's going to have lots of friction fairly early on when it's cold. That's great. That's your cold stop. That's when you're coming off the interstate and you hit the brakes for the first time and you go, whoa, brakes are there. But they can't handle a lot of heat. They fall off. As they get hot, they fall off the thing. That's when you start getting stinky brakes. You start getting pad fade. And you discover after 6 exits off the interstate that your brakes don't work so well anymore. I forgot to mention earlier on the pad fade, you can usually smell pad fade. You know what it smells like, hot brakes. Yeah, that's pad fade. So a race pad will probably look more like this. Nowhere near as good when it's cold. You get it up to a certain temperature though, and it may have more friction than the street pad. This depends on how it's done. It could be, could be up here. But more importantly, it can handle the higher temperatures. It's still generating good amounts of friction at a certain temperature, at a high temperature where the street pad has fallen off. And it will eventually hit a limit, and it may have a very small plateau here, or may have a very big plateau. Street pad tends to have a big plateau until it has nothing. These will have nothing, and then hopefully a big plateau, and then they fall off. If this is a very small plateau, then you may find that you have to do a lot of work managing, getting just the right temperature on the brakes, which is a pain in the butt to try to do. But generally speaking, if you're looking at race pads, you want to make sure that you have a high upper end up here. You want to make sure that you have a good flat plateau, and you got to make sure that you can get to that minimum temperature. If you're running a 1.6 Miata on all-season tires, you may not be able to work the brakes hard enough to get here. If you're running a 500 horsepower V8 Miata running on sticky air comps, you're looking down this end of the spectrum. Pretty simple graph. These graphs are fun. If you can find, you should be able to find these on just about any brake manufacturer's website. We do have a question over here.
Going back to rotors.
Back to rotors.
What's the advantage of a floating rotor over a normal two-piece rotor?
Floating rotor versus a normal two-piece rotor. And this is where I should have some samples with me. This was one of the questions we had on here. A floating rotor is one where the rotor itself, you've got the outer ring, and then you've got the inner ring, and the slots where they're bolted together are oval shaped. We're going to need a real zoom in on that one. And what that does is it allows the rotor to, so rotor oval shaped instead of being just normal circles. What this does, it allows the outer rotor, the one that's taking all the big heat swings, to expand without sort of locking in. If you have it locked into the center, what can happen is the outer steel ring can expand. It's prevented to by here. Then you have the potential for cracking. You have the potential for the whole rotor to sort of warp around that one and end up in a bell shape. Basically, the iron's going to want to expand. The cooler center is not going to want to expand, and those slots, those floating rotors, give it the ability to do so. You'll find that almost every two-piece rotor does have some ability to expand built into that. Rotors built for really aggressive applications will often have more going on with the float. I think I missed my calling. Look, I'm an artist. That's beautiful. Okay. We also have bedding, which is we had some questions about bedding in here. It's not really a function of the theory, but what you're doing when you're bedding brakes is you're heat cycling the pads, for one. You can smell it. It smells like brake fade. But what you're also doing is you're transferring some of that material to the rotor itself, because the brake material transfers onto the stainless steel, or the cast iron, so it's not nice and smooth. It gives it something to bite into, and that's what a bedding procedure is basically getting the the pad up to its operating temperature, keeping it there for a while, transferring a nice smooth layer of that material over to the rotor, and then letting it all cool down. If you get warped brakes, what most people call warped brakes, usually what that is, it's uneven pad transfer. It means that you got the brakes hot and you parked it and put on the handbrake, or you parked it and left your foot on it, and that has transferred a chunk of pad material to the rotor. And so now, of course, you've got uneven friction and you get that whoop, whoop, whoop through the pedal. So that's usually what brake fade, or what warped rotors are. Stop Tech has some great white papers on this stuff by a fellow named James Walker Jr. He's got some books out there as well, but they're pretty good reads if you want to read up on the basics on things like pad transfer, bedding brakes while you're doing it. It's a good resource. I'm going to go to the questions here, see what I have. Master cylinders. Lots of questions about master cylinders. This gets into our brake proportioning again. Hydraulics, I could do another complete video on hydraulics, and I could do another whole video on hydraulics. But basically, you can think of hydraulics as being a series of gears or series of levers. It's a way to take force and multiply it, move it around. The size of the pistons in the caliper, whether it's an aftermarket caliper, a big brake system, or whether it's a stock brake system, whatever, they should be well matched to the master cylinder. If you put a bigger piston in the calipers, you'll get more brake torque there, but you're going to have to move more fluid to do it, so you'll end up with a longer pedal. You end up with a soft, squishy pedal. Street drivers often don't mind a soft, squishy pedal if it means that they get lots and lots of bite, so they'll often make that trade-off. Track drivers generally get nervous when they get long pedals because of the whole brake fade, I just hit a wall kind of thing. And so track drivers are usually willing to push a little harder and get a firmer pedal, so they'll often go with a bigger master cylinder, because that means it takes less fluid to do the certain amount of work. Effectively, what you're doing is you're lowering that gear ratio, so you've got to push harder on the pedal to get a certain amount of brake torque, but it's a nice firm feeling pedal. So do you need to upgrade the master cylinder or change the master cylinder? Because it's not necessarily upgrade, change. The question is partly what you're after, but if it's a well-designed brake kit, you should not have to change the master. If someone requires you to, that means that they have made design decisions, or they've chosen a caliper that's not available in the correct size, that is going to change the way all of the hydraulics work in the car. I also have a question here that is a little bit out of line with this, but factory Brembos on a 30th anniversary, better or worse than Willwoods? And this is a fun question because we have a 2019 RF here in the shop that has our little big brake kit on it, and the boss also owns a 30th anniversary car. And the only difference between those two cars right now is the fact that ours has a little big brake kit and his has the factory Brembos. They've got the same suspension. They're both running factory wheels and tires. And he brought it back and said that there's a significant difference in brake feel on the car with the little big brake kit with our Willwoods on it. And that's due to the stiffness of the caliper, I think. It could be due to our sizing choices, but whatever, there is definitely a difference. Plus it weighs 15 pounds less, which is a nice little bonus. But yes, in that case there is. Kyle, let me know if there's any more questions coming in.
One did just come in.
We have a question.
Is there a special procedure for bleeding empty calipers after being rebuilt?
Special procedure for bleeding empty calipers after rebuilding. Now, where this question is probably coming from, we're getting a little out of brake theory here, but that's okay. Where this question is probably coming from is when you build a new master cylinder, it usually needs to be bench bled before you can start using it. You need to bleed it on the bench and make sure it's got fluid inside before you put it in the car, because it's hard to get fluid done when it's in the car. Calipers, not so much. They're a lot easier to fill up. My recommendation for calipers, you want to make your life easier, is loosen the bleed screws when you're installing it. And that way, when you're dinking around and bolting it on, you put the brake line in, and as you're dinking around with bolting it on, fluid is starting to flow through the caliper and it'll start coming out the bleed screw, and that's actually going to bleed it on its own while you're doing other things. It's a version called a gravity bleed is effectively what it is, but it's a nice little shortcut as you're putting it together. Just leave that thing loose and it will sort of self-bleed. So no, the procedure to bleed a freshly built, we're falling apart, a freshly built caliper is no different than one that has been in service and you're just flushing. Which will make me start talking about brake fluid. We talked about the effect of heat on brake pads, on rotors, but we didn't talk about brake fluid. Brake fluid is rated for certain temperatures. You've noticed DOT3, DOT4, DOT5, DOT 5.1. Those are all standards that require a certain meaning it can handle a certain, yeah, those are all standards that specify the boiling point of the fluid. A DOT 5.1 has a much higher boiling point than a DOT 4, so as you can imagine, it's much better for track use because you can ram a lot more heat in it before it boils and gives you that soft pedal and that sinking feeling in your stomach. But you have to watch out because there's both a wet boiling point and a dry boiling point. And a dry boiling point of memory is right out of the bottle. The problem with brake fluid is that it's, what's the term, hydroscopic? It absorbs water. Out of the air, it absorbs water. If there's water in your system, you've got a problem, but it will absorb that too. That's why it turns dark with time. And I think it's at 3% water content, it's considered to be wet. And at that point, the boiling temperature can be considerably lower. I don't have a thing of brake fluid in front of me to actually come up with some examples on this one, but you might find that the boiling temperature could be 150 degrees lower on wet brake fluid than it is on dry brake fluid. This is why track drivers want to change their brake fluid often, because they're putting so much heat into it, and why street cars really should change them at least once a year, because it is going to degrade even in the sealed system. It's also why you don't want to use brake fluid out of a pre-opened container, because it will have absorbed water, and so its boiling point will be lower than it was when you opened up that can. DOT5 is a special situation. It's a silicone-based brake fluid instead of the, what is it, glycol? Not glycol, that's antifreeze. Mineral oil-based brake fluid. It's not compatible with the other numbers. That's why there's a 5.1. You can consider it to be the 5 that you can use. Silicone-based fluid has a bunch of downsides. It doesn't absorb water, but that means the water pools in it, and you can end up with low points you can rust through. It's really for show cars that are being stored for a long time. Don't do it. Just use DOT 3, 4, 5.1. Stay away from DOT 5. Could have made it less confusing, possibly, I will agree, but I'm not the guy who writes the rules. Okay, questions. I have one here. Is there a line in the sand for when pads and rotors aren't enough and you need to go to a big brake kit? That's a good question. There's thousands and thousands of dollars on the line with that question, and it comes down to heat. If your standard pads and rotors can't handle the heat, if you're having constant problems with pad fade especially, then it's time to look at a big brake kit. Most of the big brake kits also have the advantage of being much easier to change pads, so if you're running one set of pads on the track and one pad on the street, you can easily swap back and forth. They may come with more pad sizes available, and being aluminum, they do shed heat a little better than the cast iron calipers that came in the car, and they tend to be stiffer as well, so you might get a better pedal feel out of it, and they're lighter. So again, like we were talking about with the Brembo thing, they are a lighter weight than what you might find from the factory. But really, if you're looking for a 100% functional answer, the answer is heat. Can your car handle the heat for what you're asking it to do? And where is that line? You either have to find it experimentally or you have to be conservative, one or the other. You can't say at a certain power level you need to upgrade to a certain brake kit, because it all depends on how you're using the car. If you're doing stage rally, you have very different requirements on the brakes than you do if you're doing track work. And if you're doing track work, it depends on where you are. A track like Laguna Seca is known as being hard on brakes, but in my experience, High Plains Raceway near Denver is absolutely brutal. I have brake problems in High Plains, or that's where I worked them the hardest, but I've never had problems at Laguna Seca. And then you have other tracks that are much, much easier on their brakes, just because of the nature of the corners, the nature of the braking zones. So there's no all-in-one answer that says at 250 horsepower you need to go to a big brake kit, because the answer is, unfortunately, how are you going to use the car? You don't really suffer from having too much brake unless you can't get them warm enough to work. So it's not necessarily a downside unless you don't like spending money. Now, who really like that? Lots of questions about brakes fitting RPF1s. Talk to Enki about that one. The RPF1 has no room inside it. It's got these big fat spokes. There's no room for the caliper. Great looking wheel, nice and light, strong, doesn't fit brakes. There's no all-in-one answer on that one. Check the templates. Your brake manufacturer should be able to give you templates you can check inside the wheel, but RPF1s are a pain in the butt to try to fit brakes inside. Do we have any more questions over there, Kyle?
Yeah. Do you recommend mixing and matching brake pads with different friction coefficients and temperature ranges?
That's a good question. I will repeat it. Do I recommend mixing different pad compounds front and rear for different friction behavior and different temperature behaviors? I generally try to avoid doing that. And the reason is because of these curves we looked at earlier. If you put, where's my pencil? My drawing device. There it is. We'll start over. get you some nice, pretty ones. This is our friction versus temperature. If you've chosen one pad that goes like this for your rear brakes, and then one pad that goes like this for your front brakes. This is great. The fronts are working harder. They're going to have more temperature. They need to deal with that higher temperature. The rears don't work as hard. You want them to come on sooner. The problem is as you move around, these ratios change. You're going to find that your brake balance changes as your brakes get hotter. So it's a common thing to do, especially if you're limited by class rules. Spec Miatas, for example, there's a very limited number of things they can do with brakes, and so they will do stuff like this to try to get their proportioning where they need it. But for a car that is not just a single-purpose car being used on a single-purpose track for a single weekend, this can cause problems. I prefer, if possible, to use the same compounds front and rear, even though the rears will run cooler, and then balance my sort of unmodified bias using hydraulics by using piston sizes, by using rotor diameter, that sort of thing. I prefer to do that as sort of the rough cut. This is a fine-tuning tool. I would rather use a proportioning valve myself. Not everyone agrees with me with that. That's fine. Really, the guy who has the right answer is the guy who won the race, but that's my reasoning. Okay, bigger master cylinder, we talked about that. How much more effective are red calipers compared to yellow? Well, I think we can, red is it's a lower energy color in the visible spectrum, isn't it? I don't know. I could make up some bullshit answer, but the biggest reason you see more red calipers than yellow is that red is a standard wheelwood color and yellow is a very high dollar optional upgrade, and so it's very expensive to put yellow calipers on your car. That's why you don't see it unless you have a Ferrari. Should I replace my brakes if they're rusty? I'm assuming that's referring to the actual rotor itself. The friction, the brake pad itself will clean off the non-rusty part. The friction surface, it'll stay clean. Whether the rest of it has a little bit of surface rust on it, it doesn't matter. If you can put your finger through it because it's rusted out, I'd be worried about that. But generally speaking, surface rust doesn't do anybody any harm. The brakes will clean themselves off. Forcing valve, good idea. Can you address the benefits of upsizing rotors and keeping stock calipers versus big brake kits? So that's the concept behind basically our little big brake kit for the NA and the NB. You can use that's upsizing rotors and stock calipers. Never mind. So that's how we do the rear brakes on some of our big brake kits. That's a brake torque question. Larger rotors with the same calipers, you're going to get more brake torque. It's going to increase the amount of brake torque at that end of the car. It'll add more brake bias at that end of the car. It looks awesome behind a set of wheels. It adds more unsprung and rotating mass. It can absorb more heat. Is it better or not? Well, that depends on what it is you're trying to do. If you're an autocrosser, you're probably going to want like little 9-inch 1.6 brakes. If you're running in the racetrack and you'll have to use factory components, then yes, the 11-inch sport stuff for sure. The big brake kits, they have other applications that we talked about earlier, or other attributes that we talked about earlier with the lighter calipers, the stiffer potentially calipers, the easier pad changes, the aluminum body to shed heat, that sort of thing. So they're both good answers. Generally speaking, though, you're going to keep the stock calipers if you're required by regulations. Otherwise, chances are you'll go to a different aftermarket caliper. What can I do to improve brake feel on a manual big brake kit set up on Miata? I'm not sure what manual means here, but brake feel, that comes out of hydraulic sizing. If brake feel, do you mean it does, this is always where we have to ask people questions. Is it not stopping fast enough? Like you don't feel like you're getting enough brake torque for a given pressure? That's one answer. That's brake pads. You might have to rebed the brakes. If it's a matter of it feels spongy, that could be old fluid. If someone calls in with this question, I would ask them a few more questions about what it is they mean by improved brake feel. And in many cases, it just feels like I step on the brake and the car doesn't stop. And the first thing I always suggest in that case is bed your brakes. Even performance brakes, like say a Porterfield R4S, if they've been used on the track, they feel great. They're nice and hot. They've been used hard a lot. They're good. If you drive them to work a bunch of times during the winter time and they never really get warm, they can almost glaze over. And rebedding them re-adheres that pad material to the rotor and can bring back your stopping power and your feel. And the nice thing about it is it's free. All you have to do is head out there, do a series of stops, and you will have improved braking feel. If you don't, well, you spent the day stopping your car. Okay, what sort of benefits for a complete novice can I get from putting higher performance pads and discs without new calipers? I think we've covered that. It's mostly about friction and heat behavior. How is the brake balance front to rear when you only upgrade the front brakes to 4-piston calipers? Again, that depends. Are you changing the diameter on it? Are you changing the sizing of it? Are you changing the pad compound? Difficult to say. Simply changing to 4-piston doesn't mean anything on its own, but chances are you're changing something else at the same time, whether it's pad size, pad diameter, or rotor diameter, piston size. So that's usually you will get more brake torque on that end. And so you may have to do something to increase the rear bias, but that's a very broad generalization. Do we have another question over there, Kyle?
Yes. Doesn't altitude affect your brake cooling and brake fade?
Huh?
Such as comparing high plains versus Laguna Seca.
Does altitude affect your cooling for brake fade? The answer is yeah, of course. And this is high plains versus Laguna Seca because people in California don't like it if you say that theirs is not the most of something. One of the reasons high plains is hard on brakes is because there's just less air to cool the brakes with. That's a legitimate problem. The thing is that High Plains Raceway will stay at that altitude. Laguna Seca will stay at its altitude, so it is a factor. But yes, the more cooling air, and we have the same problem with engines too, the more cooling air you have going through the thing, the better it will cool. And if you have 15-20% less air, there's less to cool with. So yes, you are going to have a harder time shedding heat at altitude. So if you're running down Pikes Peak, that's a factor. They actually stop you halfway down Pikes Peak and check the temperature of your brakes. And one of the reasons for that is because they don't cool like they should at lower altitudes. When you're starting at 14,000 or whatever it is, that's important. It's also a long hill. I think I've got most of this. I think I've addressed most of this. Yeah, most of these questions have been, if you were paying attention, have been answered. There is one question that's a good one. Why is it so difficult to get a strong parking brake with aftermarket rear calipers? And that has to do with how the brakes are, or the pads are clamped basically with aftermarket calipers with rear parking brakes. And specifically we're talking about the rear power light with the little arms that come out. If you're a mountain biker, you might remember cantilever brakes. Effectively, that's a cantilever brake. I think that's what they called that one. And they were never super strong on mountain bikes either. It's just the aftermarket, that's what they had available. That's what we were able to implement. And yes, it is weaker. The mechanisms to actually, there's a bunch of different ways that factories do parking brakes, but the mechanism to clamp those calipers down, or those pads down, is different on factory stuff. And it varies from car to car, so it's difficult to make generic, which is difficult for the aftermarket. So that's just the life we live in. If you don't want to deal with that parking brake problem, you're best to stay with stock calipers. Maybe you can paint them red or something because that'll make them faster. And I think that's about all I've got. Kyle, we have more questions over there.
I might rephrase this one just to maybe get a better answer. What would we recommend for daily driver brake pads?
Daily driver brake pads. That depends on what you're doing with the car when it's not being daily driven. You need to set the brake system up to deal with the worst day it's going to have. So if you're a daily driver and you also take it to, say, High Plains Raceway on the weekends, you're probably going to want to set the brakes. If your car, as a daily driver, honestly, factory pads are pretty good because they're designed to have lots of traction, lots of grip down low. You want a brake pad that does the same. If you're driving in sub-freezing temperatures, for example, that's very important. Pads like the Porterfield R4S, or some of the Hawk pads, they can certainly deal with everyday driving, but that first cold stop might be a little slippery, might not feel completely solid, especially in cold weather. And you have to decide what else you're going to use the car for. If you're using the car for autocrossing on the weekends, if you're using it for light track days on the weekends, then something like the R4S or the HP Plus might be a good choice. But you have to be aware that it will be weaker in very cold temperatures and when the brakes are cold. There is one brake pad that will always stop the car every single time. That is the Performance Friction PFC 97. It's what I used when we ran the Target Newfoundland and the V8 rally car. No matter what, we drove those through a literal hurricane. And then I've also run them at Laguna Seca. They will always stop the car. The problem is if they're outside their temperature range, they will destroy the rotors. I used to change the rotors twice for every set of pads. We call them rotor readers. It'd be big chunks of pad all over the wheels, disgusting things, but man, they stop the car. So I wouldn't recommend them as a daily driver unless you like cleaning your wheels all the time. But if you want the brake pad that can do everything, the PFC 97. Disgusting pad, but man, it stopped. Any more questions, Kyle?
No, that wraps it up.
The guys at Performance Friction are going, but we say that the pad's easy on rotors. Well, it is when it's hot, but when it's cold, boy, it isn't. Okay, well, that's it for today. You guys are probably sick of listening to me by now, which I understand. Many people in my life feel the same way. If you have any more questions about this, please put them in the comments. We will do our best to address them. We watch the comments on Facebook and on YouTube. If you want clarification on any of this stuff, again, I seem to think this book is pretty good. The guy who wrote it, he makes a lot of stuff up, but overall you can trust him. And of course, you can always call our tech line. We're always willing to help, or email us. We have a entire section of the company, bigger than some other Miata aftermarket companies, that are devoted to answering your questions, technical questions, to make sure you get the right parts for your car and that your car is working as well as possible. So that's it for today. My name's Keith Tanner. Thanks for your attention, and we hope you log in next week for our next Facebook Live and check out our YouTube channel. Thank you.